launched gas-led. It began as a prolonged series of airstrikes against Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Targets included rocket and missile launching sites, bomb-making factories, weapons caches, ammunition storage sites, training facilities, smuggling and storage tunnels, and command and control centers. After 8 days of pinpoint airstrikes, the IDF began a ground offensive on Saturday, January 3rd. Thousands of Israeli soldiers moved into Gaza from several directions, and by Monday had effectively surrounded Gaza City. By Tuesday, some news reports said that more than 500 Palestinians had died in the fighting. The IDF declared that many of those deaths were Hamas terrorists, including several prominent Hamas leaders. Most of the casualties occurred during the air campaign, but more were killed during the sporadic but often intense firefights as the Israelis advanced into Gaza. The IDF dropped leaflets in Gaza City warning Palestinian civilians to remain in their homes. It also warned citizens along the routes from Israel to Gaza City to flee to safer areas. Israel appears committed to a protracted ground conflict to stop the constant Hamas rocket and mortar attacks on southern Israeli communities. It also hopes to disable or remove the Hamas leadership that seized power in Gaza by a coup in the summer of 2007. As the Israeli war against Hamas in Gaza continues, the worldwide propaganda assault against Israel until now has shown only mixed results. But I'm sure that that will change as the fighting continues. It's important to review a little history about Gaza. In 2005, Israel unilaterally withdrew from Gaza and turned the administration over to the Palestinian Authority. All the Jewish settlements were disbanded and their residents forcibly removed. The Israeli agricultural, commercial, and residential assets, which were considerable, were abandoned to the Palestinians, which, by the way, they promptly trashed and destroyed, even though it would have enabled them to produce more food for their consumption. They were given the freedom to develop what easily could have been something like a Hong Kong of the Mediterranean. Many nations poured billions of dollars into the coffers of the Palestinian leadership to help them realize that dream. Instead, the Palestinians used the money to build a terrorist army. They purchased weapons and munitions to equip that army. They smuggled into Gaza a sizable arsenal and began to launch daily attacks on Israel's cities. They didn't even pretend to build an economic infrastructure that would enable the Gazan citizens to support themselves. That's why the partial Israeli closures of crossing points has made the life so difficult for the average Palestinian. There's no place to work except in Israel. There's none in Gaza. All the economic development money has been poured into terrorism. In spite of this glaring fraud, the world insists on rewarding the Palestinians for their open deception. The so-called enlightened and responsible nations have developed a formula exclusively for Israel. This formula determines under what circumstances and in what manner Israel is allowed to defend itself against terrorist attacks. First, the provocation must be many times more serious than would be necessary for any other nation. Simple acts of war, such as hostage-taking or continuous missile attacks against civilian population centers, are not sufficient provocation to permit defense measures. Since 2005, more than 6,000 rockets have been rained down on Israeli cities from Gaza. In a display of remarkable restraint, only after 3 years and thousands of unprovoked attacks did Israel finally feel sufficiently justified to launch a defensive response. Now the second phase of the anti-Israel propaganda assault kicks in. It begins almost immediately with the usual suspects: the Arabs, the Russians, the Muslims. all demanding an immediate Israeli withdrawal from its incursion into Gaza. Right on cue, the members of the United Nations began their usual chorus, charging that Israel's response is not proportionate. Finally, the media revs up its one-sided campaign. Its job is to spotlight the injuries and deaths of the Palestinian women and children who are accidentally or maybe deliberately placed there by the Hamas leadership and get hit during intense battles. Apparently, the months and years of constant bombardment lavished on the Israelis by Hamas thugs didn't trigger the media's interest. Only when Israel struck back did the signal go out for the mainstream drive-by media to join the fray. In Gaza, Hamas terrorists hide in classrooms and hospital basements because they know they won't be hit. They store weapons in mosques and use university laboratories for bomb-making factories. They intentionally place women and children on rooftops of buildings they know will soon be targets of the Israeli Air Force. Then, when these human shields are killed or wounded by Israeli fire, the media vents its outrage on the Israeli gunner or pilot, not the calculating terrorist that set it up. The bodies of dead terrorists or their human shields are then paraded by the ever-accommodating media as innocent victims of Israeli aggression. And the orchestrated calls for proportionality grow louder. As the selected media images mount, the predictable demands for the unconditional Israeli ceasefire rise to a global crescendo. Moderate Western governments like France, Britain, and other EU nations that have large Muslim populations begin to demand that Israel cease this disproportionate war. The worldwide cry grows until finally the United States is bullied into not vetoing a Security Council resolution condemning Israel as an unjustified aggressor. This is the formula that has always worked time after time. The Muslim world knows it will. Terrorist organizations like Hezbollah and Hamas have perfected the use of this formula to the point of using it as a tactical advantage. Islamic terrorists attack and fight until they begin to lose. Then the world rushes in and rescues them so they can fight another day. Proportionality is the key word that has been especially adapted for use against Israel in order to guarantee its eventual destruction. The historically accepted objective of defensive warfare is to eliminate an enemy's ability to harm you. The side that does that first is the winner. And until one side has accomplished that goal, the war continues. The one overriding goal of Hamas is the annihilation of Israel. It's clearly spelled out in their charter, and they confirm it at every opportunity. The 6,000 plus rocket attacks against Israel were provoked by nothing more than Israel's continued existence. As long as Israel exists, Hamas's goal remains unfulfilled and war will continue. The same can be said for most Muslims. On the other hand, Israel has demonstrated that it will absorb almost any blow before resorting to war. Israel's one goal is to secure a lasting peace. To achieve that end, Israel must eliminate the enemy's ability to wage war. If they don't, war will continue in perpetuity. The UN's definition of proportionality in the case of Israel's self-defense means that Israeli losses must be at least equal to Palestinian losses. Since they have less population than the Muslims, guess where that'll end up? See, this ensures that neither side can win, which then guarantees that war will continue until the Muslims get strong enough to finally obliterate Israel.